Halloween night, 1983. The streetlights cast long shadows across Maple Drive as children in costumes scurried from house to house, their plastic bags rustling with candy. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of laughter echoing through the suburban neighborhood. For most families, it was just another Halloween. For the Miller family, it would become the night that split their lives into before and after. 9-year-old Darren Miller adjusted his Superman cape one last time before stepping out into the evening. His brown hair was perfectly combed, and his mother had spent the better part of an hour making sure his costume looked just right. He was excited, bouncing on his toes as he clutched his trick-or-treat bag. His older sister April, 13 at the time, had already declared herself too old for such childish activities and was staying home to hand out candy. She would spend the rest of her life wishing she had gone with him. The last person to see Darren was Mrs. Henderson, from 2 houses down. She remembered him clearly because he had complimented her jack-o'-lantern, telling her it was the scariest one on the block. She watched as he walked toward the end of the street, his red cape flowing behind him in the evening breeze. That was at 7:35. By 8 o'clock, when he hadn't returned home, his parents began to worry. His father, Robert Miller, was the first to go looking. A quiet man who worked at the local hardware store, Robert walked the entire neighborhood calling Darren's name. His voice echoed off the houses, growing more desperate with each unanswered call. Other parents joined the search, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they checked every yard, every hiding spot where a 9-year-old might have wandered. But Darren was nowhere to be found. The police arrived at 9:15. Officer Martinez, a veteran cop who had seen his share of missing children cases, tried to reassure the Millers that most kids who disappeared on Halloween simply lost track of time or got turned around in an unfamiliar neighborhood. He took down the basic information with practiced efficiency, but even he seemed troubled by how quickly and completely Darren had vanished. There were no witnesses to an abduction, no suspicious vehicles, no signs of struggle. It was as if the boy had simply walked into thin air. The search continued through the night. Neighbors emerged from their homes with flashlights and lanterns, forming search parties that combed through backyards, wooded areas, and the small creek that ran behind the development. April stood at her bedroom window, watching the lights bob and weave through the darkness like fireflies, each one representing someone looking for her little brother. She pressed her face against the cold glass, willing him to come walking up the driveway with his bag full of candy and a sheepish grin on his face. But morning came, and Darren was still gone. The Halloween decorations that had seemed so festive the night before now looked ominous in the grey dawn light. Jack-o'-lanterns sat on porches with their carved grins, as if mocking the family's anguish. The search expanded, bringing in bloodhounds and volunteers from neighboring towns. The dogs picked up Darren's scent at various points throughout the neighborhood, but the trail always seemed to disappear at the same spot near the end of Maple Drive. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation began to follow predictable patterns. Police interviewed registered sex offenders in the area, followed up on reports of suspicious activity, and checked with relatives in other states. They examined every piece of physical evidence they could find, which wasn't much. Darren's trick-or-treat bag was never found. His costume pieces were never recovered. It was as if he had been erased from existence between one house and the next. The media attention was intense at first. Local news stations ran stories about the missing boy, and his school photo appeared on milk cartons and telephone poles throughout the region. The Millers appeared on television, pleading for information, for someone to come forward with anything that might help bring their son home. Robert stood beside his wife during these interviews, his arm around her shoulders, his face a mask of controlled anguish. But as weeks turned to months, the story faded from the headlines, replaced by other tragedies, other mysteries. The investigation officially stalled after 6 months. The lead detective, a man named Sullivan who had worked the case tirelessly, admitted to the family that they had exhausted all viable leads. The file would remain open, he assured them, but unless new evidence emerged, there was little more they could do. The words hit the Miller household like a death sentence. Hope, which had sustained them through the darkest months, began to crack and crumble. April watched her parents deteriorate in different ways. Her mother retreated into herself, spending hours staring out the window as if waiting for Darren to come walking up the street. She stopped cooking elaborate meals, stopped decorating for holidays, stopped participating in the life of the family. Her father threw himself into work, staying late at the hardware store, taking on extra projects, anything to avoid coming home to the silence that had replaced his son's laughter. The house itself seemed to change. Darren's room remained exactly as he had left it, his bed still unmade from that morning, his toys scattered across the floor where he had been playing before getting into his costume. The door stayed closed most of the time, but April would sometimes catch her mother standing in the doorway just looking. The silence in that room was different from the silence in the rest of the house. It was heavy, waiting, as if the room itself was holding its breath. As months passed, a strange new normal began to emerge. The family learned to navigate around the void that Darren's absence had created. They learned to have conversations that carefully avoided certain topics, to celebrate holidays with subdued enthusiasm, to answer the well-meaning questions of neighbors and friends with polite, practiced responses. But the wound never healed. It simply became part of who they were. April threw herself into school, earning grades that would eventually get her into college and away from the suffocating atmosphere of home. She felt guilty for wanting to leave, guilty for continuing to live her life, while her brother remained frozen in time as a 9-year-old boy in a Superman costume. But she also felt an overwhelming need to escape the weight of unresolved grief that seemed to press down on everything in that house. The years crawled by with agonizing slowness. Each Halloween brought fresh pain, fresh reminders of that terrible night. The family stopped participating in the holiday altogether, turning off their lights and pretending not to be home when trick-or-treaters came to the door. For April, the sight of children in costumes would always trigger a flood of memories she couldn't quite process. By the time she graduated high school, the case had become part of local folklore. New residents would learn about the Miller boy who had vanished on Halloween night, and old-timers would shake their heads and wonder what had really happened. Theories abounded, ranging from the mundane to the bizarre. Some believed he had been abducted by a passing stranger. Others whispered about satanic cults or supernatural explanations. A few cruel rumors suggested that one of the parents had been involved, but these were quickly dismissed by anyone who knew the family. April left for college with a mixture of relief and guilt, finally able to breathe freely for the first time in years. She studied psychology, perhaps hoping to understand the trauma that had shaped her family, and later met the man who would become her husband. She built a life away from Maple Drive, away from the questions and the memories and the suffocating weight of unsolved mystery. Her parents aged rapidly in those years. Her father's hair went completely gray, and deep lines etched themselves around his eyes. He began drinking more, though he was careful never to let it interfere with his work. Her mother became increasingly fragile, jumping at sudden noises, avoiding crowded places. They both seemed to be waiting for something, though they never spoke about what that might be. April would visit occasionally, always feeling like an intruder in her childhood home. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of grief had compressed the very walls. Her parents would ask about her life, her job, her husband, but there was always an underlying current of sadness that colored every conversation. They were proud of her success, but it seemed almost irrelevant in the face of their greater loss. Then in 2001, her father died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 58, but the years of carrying an unbearable burden had taken their toll. April flew home for the funeral, standing beside her mother as they watched the casket being lowered into the ground. She wondered if he had taken any secrets with him to the grave, if there had been something he knew but could never bring himself to share. Her mother lasted only 2 more years, dying peacefully in her sleep on a cold February morning. The neighbors said she had simply lost the will to live after her husband's death, but April suspected it was more complicated than that. Perhaps her mother had finally allowed herself to let go of the vigil she had been keeping for 20 years, the constant watching and waiting for a son who would never come home, which brought April to this moment, standing in her childhood home with her husband, sorting through the remnants of her parents' lives. The house would be sold, the furniture donated or discarded, the memories packed away or abandoned. It should have felt cathartic, this final closing of a chapter, but instead, it felt like another kind of death. Soon there would be no physical reminder that Darren Miller had ever existed, no shrine to his memory, no place where his ghost could rest. The basement was the last area they needed to clear out, and April had been dreading it. This was where her father had spent most of his time in his final years, tinkering with projects, organizing his tools, hiding from the world above. The smell of sawdust and machine oil hit her as she descended the wooden steps, and for a moment she was transported back to childhood, watching her father work on some household repair while she asked endless questions. His workbench stretched along one wall, covered with the organized chaos of a man who knew where everything belonged. Tools hung in precise arrangements, their outlines traced on pegboard so each one could be returned to its proper place. Coffee cans held screws and nails sorted by size, and several half-finished projects sat waiting for hands that would never return to complete them. April's husband was handling the larger items, loading power tools into boxes to be donated to a local vocational school. She focused on the smaller things, the personal items that might have some sentimental value or simply needed to be discarded. That's when she found the small metal toolbox tucked behind a stack of lumber, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden. It was an old toolbox, the kind her father had owned for as long as she could remember, its red paint worn away in spots to reveal the bare metal beneath. It felt heavier than it should have, and when she lifted it, something shifted inside with a metallic clank. She carried it over to the workbench, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the latches. The toolbox opened with a rusty squeak, and April found herself staring at contents that made no sense. Inside, nestled in a bed of old rags, was a small revolver, its metal surface pitted with rust, but still recognizably dangerous. Next to it lay a keychain, the kind children collect as souvenirs, with plastic letters spelling out DM, and below that, etched in smaller text, the date that would be burned into April's memory forever, 3110. Her hands began to shake as she lifted the keychain, turning it over in her palm as if it might transform into something innocent, something explainable. But there was no mistaking what she was looking at. This was something that had belonged to Darren, something he might have gotten as a Halloween treat or bought with his allowance. And it was here, in her father's hidden toolbox, alongside a weapon that had no business being there. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as April struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. 20 years of grief and questions and sleepless nights crystallized into this single terrible moment of discovery. The keychain felt impossibly heavy in her hand, as if it carried the weight of all the years that had passed since that Halloween night. But even as her mind reeled with implications she didn't want to consider, April knew that this was just the beginning. The toolbox had been hidden for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it had been important enough for her father to carry the secret to his grave. Now that secret belonged to her, and she would have to decide what to do with it. She looked at the keychain again, at her brother's initials and that fateful date, and felt something shift inside her chest. For 20 years, she had lived with questions that had no answers, with a mystery that had no resolution. Now, suddenly, she had evidence. It might not be the evidence she wanted, might not lead where she hoped it would, but it was something concrete, something real, and that changed everything. Because April realized, as she stood in her father's basement clutching her dead brother's keychain, that she couldn't simply close this toolbox and pretend she had never found it. She couldn't sell the house and move on with her life, carrying this new burden in silence the way her parents had carried their grief. She was going to have to find out what had really happened on Halloween night, 1983, no matter where that investigation might lead her. April sat on her father's workbench for what felt like hours, the keychain clutched in her palm, her mind racing through possibilities she didn't want to consider. The basement felt different now, charged with secrets that had been buried for 2 decades. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every corner of the space seemed to hold potential evidence of something she couldn't yet comprehend. Her husband's voice, calling from upstairs, jolted her back to reality. She quickly closed the toolbox, her heart hammering as she tried to decide what to do. Should she tell him immediately? Should she call the police? Should she pretend she had never found it and go on with her life? But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, she knew there was only one choice she could live with. She had to know the truth, whatever that truth might be. She carried the toolbox upstairs, telling her husband she had found some of her father's personal items that she wanted to go through later. He was focused on loading furniture into their rental truck, grateful for any excuse to avoid the emotional weight of sorting through decades of accumulated memories. April slipped the toolbox into her car, her hands shaking as she placed it carefully in the trunk. That night in their hotel room, April waited until her husband was asleep before taking the toolbox into the bathroom and locking the door. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the contents looked even more ominous. The gun was definitely real, though she couldn't tell if it had ever been fired or how long it had been in the toolbox. The keychain looked newer somehow, as if it had been protected from the elements that had rusted the weapon. She turned the keychain over in her hands, studying every detail. The plastic was slightly faded, the kind of cheap souvenir that might have been won at a carnival or bought from a gift shop. But the date was clear, unmistakable. October 31st, Halloween. The last day anyone had seen her brother alive. Why would her father have this? How had he gotten it? And why had he hidden it away with a gun? April's mind began to construct scenarios, each one more disturbing than the last. Had her father been involved in Darren's disappearance somehow? Had there been an accident that he had covered up? Or was there some other explanation, something innocent that she couldn't see through the fog of suspicion and grief? But try as she might, she couldn't think of any reasonable explanation for why these items would be hidden together in her father's basement. She spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, listening to her husband's steady breathing, while her own heart raced with possibilities. By morning, she had made a decision. She would conduct her own investigation, carefully and quietly, before involving anyone else. She owed it to Darren, and perhaps to her father's memory, to find out what had really happened before jumping to conclusions. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and estate management, but April's mind was elsewhere. She found herself studying her childhood memories with new eyes, looking for clues she might have missed, inconsistencies that might now make sense. She remembered her father's behavior in the weeks following Darren's disappearance, how he had thrown himself into the search with what seemed like desperate intensity. But now she began to wonder if that intensity had been born of guilt rather than love. She recalled how he would sometimes stare off into space during family meals, how he had aged so rapidly in the months after the disappearance, how he had begun drinking more. At the time, everyone had attributed these changes to grief. Now April wondered if there had been something darker eating away at him. She decided to start with the police file, if she could gain access to it. After some research, she learned that as a family member, she could request copies of the investigation documents. It took several phone calls and a formal written request, but eventually she was told that the files would be available for pickup at the county sheriff's office. Detective Sullivan, the original investigator, had retired years earlier, but April managed to track down his phone number through the department's alumni association. When she called, she was surprised by how clearly he remembered the case. His voice carried the weight of old frustration as he spoke about the investigation that had haunted him throughout his career. "Your brother's case was one of the ones that never let me sleep easy," he told her over the phone. "We followed every lead we had, interviewed everyone in the neighborhood multiple times, but it was like he just vanished into thin air. I always felt like we were missing something important, but I could never put my finger on what it was." April hesitated before asking her next question. "Detective Sullivan, do you remember anything unusual about my father's behavior during the investigation? Anything that struck you as odd?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Your father was intense about the search, more so than most parents, and that's saying something. He was out there every night with a flashlight, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning. We had to tell him to go home and get some rest. But grief affects people differently, you know? I never thought there was anything suspicious about it. Did you ever suspect that someone in the family might have been involved?" Another pause, longer this time. "Look, Mrs. Chen, I'll be straight with you. In cases like this, we always look at the family first. It's unfortunate, but statistics don't lie. Most children who go missing are harmed by someone they know. We investigated your parents thoroughly, looked into their finances, their marriage, their backgrounds. There was nothing there. Your father passed a polygraph test. Your mother was home handing out candy with dozens of witnesses. From an investigative standpoint, they were cleared completely." But April caught something in his tone. "Thou sound like there's a but coming." There were a few things that never quite added up, small things probably meaningless. Your father's timeline for that evening was a little fuzzy. He said he was at work until 6, but his boss remembered him leaving earlier, around 4:30. When we asked him about it, he said he had forgotten about stopping to get gas and running a few errands. Innocent enough, but it always bothered me that he hadn't mentioned it initially. April felt her stomach clench. "What else?" "There was a witness who thought she saw your father's truck near the end of Maple Drive around the time Darren disappeared, But it was Halloween, lots of cars were coming and going, and she wasn't entirely certain. Plus, your father lived on that street, so it wouldn't have been unusual for him to be driving around the neighborhood, especially once the search started. These details hit April like physical blows. Her father's truck near where Darren was last seen, a discrepancy in his timeline. Small things, as Detective Sullivan had said, but they took on new significance in light of what she had found in the toolbox. Detective, I need to tell you something. I found some items in my father's basement that I think might be connected to the case. She described the toolbox and its contents, hearing Sullivan's sharp intake of breath when she mentioned the keychain with Darren's initials and the date. Jesus Christ, he muttered, after all these years. Look, Mrs. Chen, you need to bring those items to the current investigators immediately. This could change everything. But April wasn't ready for that step yet. Detective, I need to ask you for a favor. I want to understand what happened before I turn this over to the police. I need to know if my father was involved, and if so, how. Can you give me some time to investigate on my own? Ma'am, I understand your need for answers, but this is potential evidence in a criminal case. You could be compromising the investigation by holding on to it. The investigation has been cold for 20 years. A few more days won't matter. Please, I just need to know what I'm dealing with before I bring in the authorities. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. I retired 5 years ago, so I'm speaking as a private citizen now, not as a law enforcement officer. If you're determined to look into this yourself, be careful. If your father was involved in your brother's disappearance, there might be other people who know about it. People who have been keeping quiet for 20 years and might not appreciate you stirring things up. After ending the call, April felt more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She began by making a list of everyone who had been interviewed during the original investigation, cross-referencing it with current phone directories and social media to see who might still be reachable. Many of the original neighbors had moved away, but a few remained on Maple Drive. She decided to start with Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had seen Darren last. According to the phone directory, Eleanor Henderson still lived at the same address, 2 houses down from where April had grown up. The thought of knocking on that door, of reopening old wounds, made April's chest tight with anxiety, but she knew she had to start somewhere. Mrs. Henderson was now in her 80s, but her memory of that Halloween night remained sharp. She invited April in for tea, and they sat in a living room that still smelled of the same lavender sachets April remembered from her childhood. Mrs. Henderson's eyes grew sad as she spoke about that evening, about the little boy in the Superman costume who had complimented her jack-o'-lantern. I've thought about that night so many times over the years, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice quavering slightly. I keep wondering if there was something I should have noticed, something I could have done differently. Your poor parents, the way they suffered. And you, dear, growing up with that shadow over your family. April carefully steered the conversation toward her father, asking about his behavior during the search, his interactions with neighbors and police. Mrs. Henderson confirmed that Robert Miller had been tireless in his efforts to find Darren, but she also mentioned something that made April's blood run cold. You know, there was one thing that always struck me as odd, Mrs. Henderson said, setting down her teacup with a slight tremor in her hands. The night Darren disappeared, I saw your father come home from work around 5 o'clock, just like always. But then, maybe an hour later, I saw him leave again. I remember because I was watching for trick-or-treaters, and I noticed his truck pull out of the driveway. I assumed he was going to the store or something, but he didn't come back until much later, after all the commotion had started. April felt the room spinning around her. Are you sure about the timing? Oh, yes, dear. I remember because I was debating whether to light my jack-o'-lantern yet. It was still light outside, maybe 6 o'clock or so. Your father left, and then maybe 30 or 45 minutes later, I saw Darren walking down the street in his costume. I never saw your father's truck come back until after we had all started searching. This timeline created a gap that hadn't appeared in any of the police reports April had seen. Her father had left the house before Darren disappeared and hadn't returned until after the search began. Where had he gone during those crucial hours? And why hadn't he mentioned this to the police? April left Mrs. Henderson's house with her head spinning, the keychain seeming to burn in her purse where she carried it as a constant reminder of the mystery she was trying to solve. She sat in her car for several minutes, trying to process what she had learned. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was building into a picture she didn't want to see. That evening, She called her husband and told him she needed to stay in town for a few more days to handle some additional estate matters. It wasn't entirely a lie, she told herself. She was handling family business, just not the kind he would expect. He was understanding, as always, and she felt guilty for not telling him the truth. But this was something she needed to do alone, at least until she understood what she was dealing with. The next morning, April drove to the library and spent hours going through old newspaper archives, reading every article about Darren's disappearance. Most of the information was familiar, but she found a few details that had been forgotten over the years. There had been reports of a man asking unusual questions about local children in the weeks before Halloween, but the lead had never panned out. Several neighbors had reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area, but none of the descriptions matched. What struck April most forcefully was reading her parents' quotes in those old articles, her mother's desperate pleas for information, her father's careful statements about cooperation with the police. But now, knowing what she knew, his words seemed guarded, calculated in a way that suggested he was being careful not to reveal too much. She found one article that quoted her father directly. "We're doing everything we can to help the police find Darren. We just want our son back home safe." It was a perfectly reasonable statement from a worried parent, but something about the phrasing bothered April. It was passive, placing the responsibility entirely on the police rather than expressing his own determination to find his son. As she read through these old accounts, April began to notice other small inconsistencies. Her father had told reporters that Darren had left for trick-or-treating at 7 o'clock, but Mrs. Henderson's timeline suggested it was closer to 6:30. Again, a small discrepancy that could be explained by the stress and confusion of that night, but it added to the growing pile of questions. By late afternoon, April had compiled a list of every person mentioned in the newspaper articles who might still be alive and living in the area. She spent the evening making phone calls, introducing herself as Darren's sister, and asking if people would be willing to talk about what they remembered from that night. Most were sympathetic and willing to help, though few had much new information to offer. But one conversation stood out. Tom Bradley, who had lived across the street from the Millers, agreed to meet April for coffee the next morning. His voice on the phone carried an odd undertone, as if there was something he wanted to say but wasn't sure he should. When April pressed him gently, he finally said, "There are some things about that night that I've never talked about with anyone. Maybe it's time." That night, April lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her hotel room, the keychain on the nightstand beside her catching the light from the parking lot outside. She was beginning to understand that her investigation was leading her into territory she hadn't expected, toward truths that might be more painful than the uncertainty she had lived with for 20 years. But there was no turning back now. Tomorrow, she would meet with Tom Bradley and hear whatever it was he had kept secret for 2 decades. And after that, she would continue following the trail wherever it led, even if it destroyed everything she had believed about her father and her family, because Darren deserved the truth, whatever that truth might be, and she was the only one left who could find it for him. Tom Bradley was waiting for April when she arrived at the small coffee shop on Main Street, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He was in his late 60s now, his hair completely grey, but April recognized him immediately as the man who used to wave to her from across the street when she was a child. His expression was troubled, and he seemed to age another 10 years as she sat down across from him. "I've been thinking about this conversation for 20 years, he said without preamble. "There were things I saw that night, things that didn't make sense then, and make even less sense now. But I kept quiet because I didn't want to cause more pain for your family and because I wasn't sure what any of it meant." April's hands trembled as she lifted her coffee cup. "Please, just tell me what you remember." Tom took a deep breath, his eyes focused on something beyond the coffee shop window. "I was working late in my garage that night, finishing up some repairs on my car. It was maybe 6:15, 6:30, when I saw your father's truck pull out of your driveway. Nothing unusual about that, except he was driving fast. Faster than anyone should drive through a neighborhood full of kids getting ready for trick-or-treating." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "About 15 minutes later, maybe 20, I saw Darren come out of your house in his costume. He looked so excited, you know, bouncing on his toes the way kids do when they're happy about something. He started walking toward the end of the street, toward the Hendersons' house." April nodded, encouraging him to continue even though her heart was racing. "Here's the thing that's bothered me all these years," Tom said, leaning forward across the small table. Maybe 10 minutes after I saw Darren heading down the street, your father's truck came back, but instead of pulling into your driveway, he parked at the curb about 3 houses down. I could see him sitting in the truck just watching. At first I thought maybe he was keeping an eye on Darren, making sure he was safe while trick-or-treating. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, even though there were only a handful of other customers. April struggled to keep her voice steady. How long did he sit there? That's what was so strange. He sat there for maybe 20-25 minutes. I kept glancing over because it seemed odd, you know. And then suddenly he got out of the truck and started walking quickly toward the end of the street, in the same direction Darren had gone. That was the last time I saw either of them until all the searching started. April felt like she might be sick. Did you see them together? Did you see my father catch up with Darren? No, that's just it. My view was blocked by the Hendersons' house once they got to that end of the street. But here's what really bothers me, April. When your father came back later during the search, he was acting like he had just gotten home from work, like he had no idea Darren was missing. But I knew he had been out there. I knew he had seen Darren leave the house. Tom's revelation felt like a physical blow. April tried to process what she was hearing, to find some innocent explanation for her father's behavior. But every scenario she constructed led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Her father had lied to the police about his whereabouts that evening. Tom, why didn't you tell the police about this at the time? His face flushed with obvious guilt. I should have. I know that now. But your father seemed so devastated, so broken by what had happened, and I kept thinking there had to be some explanation, some reason why he hadn't mentioned being out there. Maybe he was embarrassed that he had been watching Darren without telling him, or maybe he was protecting him from something. I didn't want to add to your family's pain by suggesting that your father was hiding something, but you've regretted not speaking up. Every single day for 20 years, Tom's voice cracked slightly, especially after I saw how it destroyed your parents, how it ate away at them. I kept thinking that if I had spoken up, maybe the police would have found out what really happened. Maybe your family could have had some peace. April reached across the table and touched Tom's hand. You were trying to protect us. I understand that. But I need you to tell me everything else you remember, no matter how painful it might be. Tom nodded, composing himself. There was one more thing. A few days after Darren disappeared, I saw your father in his backyard digging. It was early in the morning, maybe 6 o'clock, and he was out there with a shovel working on something near the back fence. When I asked him about it later, he said he was planting some bushes that your mother had wanted. But I never saw any bushes go in the ground. The implications of this hit April like a punch to the gut. She managed to thank Tom and excuse herself, but she barely made it to her car before the tears started flowing. 20 years of believing her father was a victim of circumstances, 20 years of watching him carry the burden of grief, and now she was discovering that he might have been carrying the burden of guilt instead. She drove aimlessly through the town for over an hour, trying to process what she had learned. The evidence was still circumstantial, but it was building into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Her father had lied about his whereabouts on the night Darren disappeared. He had been seen following the same path Darren had taken. He had been digging in the backyard days later, claiming to plant bushes that never appeared. And then there was the toolbox, with its damning contents hidden away for 2 decades. April finally parked at the local cemetery, where her parents were buried side by side under a simple headstone that read, "Together Forever." She sat on the grass beside their graves, pulling the keychain from her purse and turning it over in her hands. "Dad," she whispered to the stone, "what did you do? What happened that night?" But the dead don't answer questions, and April was left alone with her growing certainty that her father had been involved in Darren's disappearance somehow. The question now was how deep that involvement went, and whether there were others who knew the truth. She decided to visit the old house, which still sat empty pending its sale. Using the key she had kept from the estate, April let herself in and stood in the living room, where her family had once gathered for dinner, for holidays, for the ordinary moments that make up a life. Now the house felt hollow, stripped of furniture and memories, but still holding its secrets. She walked to the back door and looked out at the yard, trying to imagine where her father might have been digging that morning Tom had seen him. The fence line was overgrown now, but she could make out areas where the ground seemed slightly uneven, where something might have been buried, and the earth had never quite settled back to its original level. The thought of what might be buried in her childhood backyard made April feel physically ill, but she knew she couldn't ignore the possibility. If her father had been involved in Darren's disappearance, if something terrible had happened that night, then the evidence might still be here, waiting to be discovered. She called a rental company and arranged to have a small excavator delivered to the house the next morning. When the clerk asked what she was planning to dig up, she said she was landscaping the property for sale. It wasn't entirely a lie, she told herself. She was uncovering things that had been buried. That evening, April sat in her hotel room and made a list of everything she knew, everything she suspected, and everything she still needed to find out. The picture that emerged was deeply disturbing, but it was still incomplete. She had evidence that her father had lied about his whereabouts, evidence that he had been near the scene when Darren disappeared, evidence that he had been digging in the backyard afterward. But she still didn't know what had actually happened or why. She tried to imagine scenarios that might explain everything she had learned. Had there been an accident? Had her father somehow been responsible for Darren's death and covered it up? Had he been protecting someone else? Or was there some other explanation that she couldn't see? The one thing she couldn't bring herself to consider was that her father had deliberately harmed Darren. Despite everything she had discovered, despite the mounting evidence of deception, she still couldn't believe that the man who had read her bedtime stories and taught her to ride a bicycle was capable of hurting his own son. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of traffic on the street below, April was forced to confront a terrible possibility. Maybe she hadn't known her father as well as she thought. Maybe the grief and guilt she had seen consuming him over the years hadn't been the result of losing a child, but the result of being responsible for that loss. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a light rain that seemed appropriate for what April was about to do. The excavator arrived on schedule, and the operator, a middle-aged man named Dave, walked the backyard with her to identify the areas she wanted explored. "Are you sure you want to dig up your whole yard?" he asked, looking skeptical. "That's going to be expensive, and you'll have a hell of a mess to clean up." April pointed to the area near the back fence where Tom had seen her father digging. "Let's start there. If we don't find anything, we can stop." Dave shrugged and fired up the machine. The first scoop of earth came up dark and rich, full of earthworms and the detritus of 20 years of fallen leaves. But as they went deeper, the soil became harder, more compacted, as if it had been disturbed and then packed down again. 3 feet down, the excavator bucket hit something that made a different sound, a hollow thunk that made both April and Dave pause. He shut off the machine and climbed down to look more closely at what they had found. "Mom," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "I think you need to see this." April approached the hole on unsteady legs, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. At the bottom of the excavation, partially exposed by the excavator bucket, was what looked like a piece of rotted fabric, dark blue fabric that might once have been part of a Superman costume. She fell to her knees beside the hole, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what they had found began to sink in. After 20 years of searching, of wondering, of hoping against hope that Darren might somehow still be alive, she was looking at evidence that he had been here all along, buried in their own backyard. Dave was already reaching for his cell phone. "Mom, I'm calling the police. This is way beyond what I signed up for." April nodded numbly, unable to speak. The excavation had revealed more than just fabric. There were small bones visible now, the unmistakable remains of a child who had been buried here 2 decades ago. Her little brother, who had left the house excited about Halloween and never made it past his own backyard. As they waited for the police to arrive, April sat in the rain beside the grave they had uncovered, the keychain clutched in her hand, finally understanding the full weight of what her father had been carrying all these years. He hadn't just lost a son that Halloween night, he had buried one. And now, 20 years later, Darren was finally coming home. The police arrived within 20 minutes, their sirens cutting through the quiet suburban morning like a knife. April watched from the back porch as they cordoned off the yard with yellow tape, transforming her childhood home into a crime scene. Detective Maria Santos, who had taken over cold cases from the retired Detective Sullivan, approached April with the kind of careful compassion that comes from years of delivering terrible news to families. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to tell me exactly how you came to be digging in this location," Detective Santos said, her voice gentle but professional. "And I need to know about anything else you might have found recently that could be connected to your brother's disappearance. April's hands shook as she retrieved the toolbox from her car, setting it down on the porch between herself and the detective. The metal felt cold and heavy, weighted with 20 years of secrets. When she opened the latches and revealed the contents, Detective Santos's expression shifted from professional concern to sharp attention. "Where exactly did you find this?" "In my father's basement workshop hidden behind some lumber. I was cleaning out the house for sale when I discovered it." April's voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant, as if someone else was speaking. Detective Santos carefully photographed the toolbox and its contents before sealing them in evidence bags. The keychain disappeared into a plastic envelope, taking with it the last physical connection April had to her brother's final day. The gun would be sent for ballistics testing, though April suspected they wouldn't find much after 20 years of basement storage. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask you some difficult questions now. Based on what we've found here today, this case has become a homicide investigation. That means everyone connected to your brother, including family members, will need to be re-interviewed and re-investigated." April nodded, though the word homicide hit her like a physical blow. She had known, intellectually, that finding Darren's remains would mean someone had killed him, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the reality inescapable. Her 9-year-old brother hadn't simply vanished or run away or been taken by a stranger. Someone had ended his life and buried him in their own backyard. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The coroner arrived to oversee the careful excavation of the remains. Crime scene technicians photographed everything from multiple angles, documenting 20 years of soil layers and decomposition. April watched from the kitchen window as they worked with meticulous precision, treating her brother's grave with the scientific detachment necessary for their job. Detective Santos returned to the house around noon, her expression grave. "Mrs. Chen, the medical examiner has made some preliminary observations that I need to discuss with you. The remains appear to be those of a child approximately 9 years old, which is consistent with your brother's age at the time of his disappearance. However, there are some concerning findings." April braced herself for whatever was coming next. "There appears to be trauma to the skull, consistent with blunt force impact. We won't know the exact cause of death until the full autopsy is completed, but the initial examination suggests this was not an accident." The kitchen seemed to tilt around April as the implications sank in. Not an accident. Someone had deliberately struck her brother hard enough to kill him. Someone had murdered a 9-year-old boy on Halloween night and then buried the evidence in his own backyard. "Detective, based on the location of the grave and the evidence I found, I think my father was involved somehow, but I can't believe he would have deliberately hurt Darren. There has to be more to this story." Detective Santos nodded thoughtfully. "We're going to investigate every possibility, Mrs. Chen, but I have to tell you the evidence is pointing in a very specific direction. Your father's behavior that night, the location of the burial, the hidden evidence, it all suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the family and access to the property. But why? What possible reason could he have had? That's what we need to find out. I'm going to need you to think back to that time period, to anything unusual in your father's behavior or your family dynamics. Were your parents having marital problems? Was there any tension in the household? Any indication that your father might have been under unusual stress?" April tried to remember, but her memories of that time were colored by the trauma of losing Darren. She had been 13, focused on her own teenage concerns, probably not paying close attention to adult undercurrents in the household, but as she thought back, certain details began to emerge. Her parents had been arguing more in the months before Darren disappeared. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of low-level tension that families sometimes experience. Her father had been working longer hours, coming home tired and irritable. Her mother had seemed stressed about money, though April hadn't understood the details at the time. "There was something," April said slowly. "A few weeks before Halloween, I remember overhearing my parents talking in their bedroom. My mother was upset about something, and my father kept saying he would take care of it. I didn't understand what they were talking about then, but my mother was crying." Detective Santos made notes as April spoke. "Do you remember anything else about that conversation? Any specific words or phrases?" April closed her eyes, trying to reach back through 20 years of suppressed memories. "My mother said something about not being able to live with it anymore, and my father said that some secrets were worth keeping, that some things were more important than the truth." The detective's pen stopped moving. That's a very specific thing to remember after all these years. It stuck with me because it didn't make sense. What secrets could my parents possibly have been keeping? We were just an ordinary family. Or at least I thought we were. Over the next several days, as the investigation intensified, April found herself reliving her childhood through a completely different lens. Detective Santos interviewed her multiple times, each session revealing new details that had been buried beneath years of grief and carefully constructed family mythology. The financial records that police uncovered painted a picture of a family under severe stress. Robert Miller had been laid off from his job at the hardware store 6 months before Darren's disappearance, though he had continued to leave the house each morning as if going to work. The family's savings had been drained, and they were behind on mortgage payments. The stress of keeping up appearances while facing financial ruin had apparently been enormous. "Your father was facing bankruptcy," Detective Santos explained during one of their meetings. He had been borrowing money from family members, taking cash advances on credit cards, even taking out a second mortgage without your mother's knowledge. By October 1983, he was out of options. April struggled to reconcile this information with her memories of that time. She hadn't known about her father's job loss, hadn't realized the family was in financial trouble. Her parents had worked hard to maintain normalcy for their children, continuing to provide the same allowances, the same activities, the same comfortable lifestyle they had always known. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Robert Miller had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on both of his children just 3 months before Darren disappeared. The policy on Darren alone was worth $50,000, a significant sum in 1983, and certainly enough to solve the family's immediate financial problems. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask you this directly," Detective Santos said, her voice heavy with the weight of implication. "Is it possible that your father killed your brother for the insurance money?" The question hung in the air between them, like a physical presence. April felt something inside her chest crack and break, the last vestige of the father she had loved and mourned for 20 years. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, leading to a conclusion so horrible she had refused to consider it, even as the facts piled up around her. "But he never collected the insurance," April said weakly, grasping for any detail that might save her father's memory. "Darren was never declared dead. The policy was never paid out." "That's true, but think about it from your father's perspective. In those first few hours after whatever happened, maybe he thought he could make it look like a kidnapping, collect the ransom money instead of the insurance. Or maybe he panicked after burying the body and realized he couldn't go through with filing a claim without arousing suspicion. We may never know exactly what his plan was, but the insurance policy establishes a clear motive." April left that meeting feeling like her entire life had been built on lies. The father she remembered, the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with homework, had apparently been capable of murdering his own son for money. The grief she had watched consume him over the years hadn't been the result of losing a child, but the result of what he had done to that child. But even as she tried to accept this new reality, part of April rebelled against it. There were still pieces that didn't fit, still questions that needed answers. If her father had planned Darren's murder, why had he hidden the gun and keychain instead of disposing of them? Why had he kept evidence that could incriminate him? And why had he suffered so visibly for 20 years if he was simply a cold-blooded killer motivated by money? That evening, April sat in her hotel room with copies of all the police reports, trying to construct a timeline of that Halloween night that made sense. Her father had left work early, around 4:30. He had come home briefly, then left again around 6 o'clock, just before Darren went out trick-or-treating. According to Tom Bradley, he had parked down the street and watched as Darren walked toward the end of Maple Drive. Then he had followed. What happened next was the crucial gap that the investigation needed to fill. Had her father confronted Darren about something? Had there been an argument that escalated to violence? Had it been premeditated murder, or a moment of rage that spiraled out of control? The keychain suggested that Darren had been excited about Halloween, that he had been looking forward to trick-or-treating. He had no reason to be afraid of his father, no reason to run or fight. If Robert Miller had approached his son on the street, Darren would have gone with him willingly, trusting the man who was supposed to protect him. April found herself crying as she imagined those final moments, her little brother confused and frightened as his own father turned violent. Had Darren understood what was happening? Had he called out for help? Had he wondered why the person he loved and trusted was hurting him? But as painful as these thoughts were, April knew she couldn't stop searching for the truth. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends that needed to be tied up. And somewhere in those remaining mysteries, she sensed there was something even darker waiting to be discovered. The next morning brought news that would change everything April thought she knew about that Halloween night. Detective Santos called early, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "Mrs. Chen, we've found something else. The crime scene team discovered a second burial site in your backyard, about 10 feet from where we found your brother. We're going to need you to come down to the station immediately." As April drove to the police station, her mind raced with possibilities she didn't want to consider. Another burial site meant another victim. But who? And why would there be 2 graves in her family's backyard? The investigation that had already shattered everything she believed about her father was about to reveal something even worse. The police station felt different this time, charged with an energy that made April's skin crawl. Detective Santos met her at the front desk, her expression carefully controlled, but unable to hide the underlying tension. As they walked toward the interview room, April caught glimpses of other officers huddled in serious conversation, their voices dropping to whispers when they noticed her passing. "Mrs. Chen, what we discovered this morning changes the entire scope of this investigation," Detective Santos began once they were seated. The second burial site contained the remains of an adult female, approximately 30 to 35 years old at the time of death. The body shows signs of having been buried around the same time period as your brother's remains. April felt the room spinning around her. An adult female? Who could that possibly be? That's what we're trying to determine. The remains are too deteriorated for visual identification, but we're running dental records and DNA tests. What I need from you right now is help constructing a list of women who might have gone missing around that time. Women who might have had some connection to your family. April's mind raced through the possibilities, but nothing made sense. She couldn't think of any woman who had disappeared from their lives around Halloween 1983. Their family had been small, insular, with few close friends or relatives who visited regularly. "Detective, this doesn't make any sense. My father wasn't the kind of person who knew many people outside of work and immediate family, and if someone had gone missing, if there had been another investigation, wouldn't we have known about it? Not necessarily. Missing persons cases involving adults are handled differently than those involving children. Adults have the right to disappear if they choose to, so unless there's evidence of foul play, investigations often get less attention. It's possible that someone went missing around that time and the case never received much publicity." Detective Santos pulled out a thick file folder and spread several photographs across the table. "These are the personal items we found with the remains. I need you to look at them carefully and tell me if you recognize anything." April forced herself to examine the evidence photos, though her stomach churned at the thought of what they represented. Most of the items were too deteriorated to identify clearly, but one photograph made her breath catch in her throat. It showed a small piece of jewelry, a delicate gold chain with a distinctive pendant in the shape of a butterfly. "I've seen that necklace before," April whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I can't remember where." "Think carefully, Mrs. Chen. Any detail could be important." April closed her eyes, trying to reach back through her memories. The butterfly necklace seemed familiar, but the memory was elusive, dancing just beyond her grasp. Then suddenly, it clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her eyes snapping open. "Jennifer Patterson. She was our babysitter sometimes, usually when my parents had to work late or go out for the evening. She always wore that butterfly necklace. She said it was a gift from her grandmother." Detective Santos leaned forward intently. "Tell me everything you remember about Jennifer Patterson." April struggled to piece together memories that were over 20 years old. She was young, maybe 19 or 20. She lived a few streets over, I think. She was always very sweet with Darren and me, very patient. She would let us stay up a little past our bedtime and would make us hot chocolate before putting us to sleep. "When was the last time you saw her?" The question hit April like a physical blow as the timeline began to crystallize in her mind. "I think it was sometime in the fall of 1983. She had been babysitting for us regularly, but then she just stopped coming around. My parents told us she had gotten a new job and couldn't babysit anymore." "Do you remember the exact timing? Was it before or after Halloween?" April felt sick as she realized the implications of the question. "I think it was before Halloween. maybe a week or two before. I remember being disappointed because I had wanted to show her my costume. Detective Santos made careful notes as April spoke. Mrs. Chen, I need you to think very carefully about this next question. Do you remember anything unusual about your father's behavior around the time Jennifer stopped babysitting? Any changes in his routine or his mood? The memories came flooding back now, details that April had forgotten or dismissed as unimportant at the time. Her father had seemed agitated in the weeks before Halloween, staying up late and pacing the house. She had heard him talking on the phone in hushed tones, conversations that stopped abruptly when she or Darren entered the room. There was something, April said slowly. One night, maybe 2 weeks before Halloween, I got up to get a glass of water, and I heard my father on the phone. He was talking very quietly, but he sounded angry, almost threatening. He kept saying something about keeping quiet and not causing problems. Did you hear anything else? Any names or specific details? April shook her head. I was afraid to listen too closely. My father never spoke like that, so harsh and cold. It scared me, so I went back to bed. As they talked, a horrible picture began to emerge. Jennifer Patterson had disappeared sometime in mid-October 1983, just a few weeks before Darren's death. The family had been told she had gotten a new job, but now it seemed likely that she had been murdered and buried in the Miller backyard. But why? What could possibly have motivated Robert Miller to kill their babysitter? And what was the connection between her death and Darren's disappearance 2 weeks later? Detective Santos excused herself to make some phone calls, leaving April alone with the evidence photos and her racing thoughts. She stared at the image of the butterfly necklace, remembering how Jennifer used to fidget with it when she was nervous or thinking. The young woman had been so full of life, so kind to April and Darren. What had happened to her in those final moments? Had she suffered? Had she been afraid? When Detective Santos returned, she carried a manila folder thick with documents. Mrs. Chen, we've located the missing persons report filed for Jennifer Patterson. It was filed by her roommate on October 15, 1983, exactly 16 days before your brother disappeared. April felt her world tilting further off its axis. What did the report say? According to her roommate, Jennifer had gone out on the evening of October 14th and never came home. She had told her roommate she was going to babysit, but she didn't specify for which family. The roommate assumed she had decided to spend the night wherever she was babysitting, which apparently happened sometimes. It wasn't until the next evening, when Jennifer failed to show up for her regular job at the local diner, that the roommate became concerned. The detective opened the folder and pulled out a photocopy of the original police report. The investigating officer spoke with several families that Jennifer babysat for regularly, including yours. According to the report, your father told police that Jennifer had not been scheduled to babysit that evening and that he hadn't seen her for several days. April read through the report, her hands shaking as she absorbed the details. Her father had lied to the police about Jennifer, just as he had lied about his whereabouts on Halloween night. The pattern of deception was becoming impossible to ignore. Detective, what do you think happened? Why would my father have killed Jennifer, and what does it have to do with Darren's death? Detective Santos was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to share. We're still developing our theory, Mrs. Chen, but based on the evidence we've gathered so far, it appears that your father may have been involved in some kind of inappropriate relationship with Jennifer Patterson. If she threatened to expose that relationship, it could have provided a motive for murder. The suggestion hit April like a slap. Her father, having an affair with their teenage babysitter. It seemed impossible, completely at odds with the man she remembered. But then again, everything she had believed about her father was crumbling under the weight of evidence. But even if that were true, why would he hurt Darren? What could a 9-year-old possibly have known or done? Children see more than adults realize, Mrs. Chen. It's possible that Darren witnessed something he shouldn't have, or knew something that made him a threat. In cases like this, the perpetrator often feels they have no choice but to eliminate potential witnesses. April felt bile rising in her throat as the full horror of what Detective Santos was suggesting sank in. Her father had killed Jennifer Patterson to cover up an affair, and then killed his own son to prevent him from revealing what he had seen. It was a level of cold calculation and cruelty that she couldn't reconcile with her memories of the man who had raised her. "I need some air," April said, standing abruptly from the table. "This is too much. I can't process all of this." Detective Santos nodded understandingly. I know this is incredibly difficult, Mrs. Chen, but I need you to understand that this investigation is far from over. We have 2 murder victims buried in your childhood backyard, and your father is the primary suspect in both cases. We need to uncover every detail of what happened during those weeks in October 1983. April stepped outside the police station into the crisp afternoon air, trying to clear her head and make sense of everything she had learned. The investigation that had started with a simple desire to understand her brother's disappearance had uncovered a web of lies, deception, and murder that stretched back over 20 years. But even as the evidence mounted against her father, April couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. The timeline was becoming clearer, but the motivations still seemed incomplete. Why had her father kept the gun and keychain instead of disposing of them? Why had he suffered so visibly for 20 years if he was simply a calculating killer covering his tracks? As she walked back to her car, April made a decision. She would continue her own investigation, parallel to the police work, trying to uncover the full truth about what had happened to her family. Because despite everything she had learned, despite the mounting evidence of her father's guilt, she sensed that the real story was even darker and more complex than anyone yet realized. That evening, April sat in her hotel room with a legal pad, trying to construct a timeline of events that made sense. October 14th. Jennifer Patterson disappears after allegedly going to babysit. October 31st. Darren disappears while trick-or-treating and is presumably killed the same night. Both bodies end up buried in the Miller backyard, both deaths apparently connected to Robert Miller. But there were still gaps in the timeline, still questions that needed answers. What had happened during those 16 days between the 2 murders? Had Jennifer's body been buried immediately, or had her father kept it hidden somewhere else first? And most importantly, what had triggered the decision to kill Darren? What had the 9-year-old boy done or seen that signed his death warrant? April was beginning to realize that to answer these questions, she would need to dig deeper into her own memories, to examine her childhood with the brutal honesty of an investigator rather than the protective nostalgia of a daughter. Because somewhere in those suppressed memories, buried beneath 20 years of grief and careful forgetting, lay the key to understanding what had really happened during those terrible weeks in the fall of 1983. And she was starting to suspect that when she found that key, it would unlock secrets that were even darker than anything she had yet imagined. April spent the next morning at the local library, poring over old phone books and city directories from 1983, trying to piece together more information about Jennifer Patterson's life. The young woman had lived in a small apartment complex, about 8 blocks from the Miller house, close enough to walk to babysitting jobs, but far enough away that their social circles wouldn't have overlapped naturally. The apartment manager from 1983 was long gone, but April managed to track down the phone number of Jennifer's former roommate, a woman named Carol Summers, who now lived in the next county. When April called and explained who she was, Carol's voice immediately became tense and guarded. "I remember that time," Carol said carefully. "Jenny just vanished one night. The police asked a lot of questions, but they never found any answers. Why are you bringing this up again after all these years?" April explained about finding her brother's remains and the discovery of the second burial site. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Carol spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh my God, Jenny's really dead, isn't she? After all these years of wondering, of hoping maybe she had just run away or started a new life somewhere. Carol, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Jennifer's relationship with my family. The police think there might have been something inappropriate going on between her and my father." Another long pause. "I don't know if I should be talking about this. Jenny made me promise never to tell anyone, and I kept that promise even after she disappeared. But if she's really dead, if someone killed her, please, Carol, I need to know the truth about what happened." Carol took a shaky breath. Jenny was troubled about something in the weeks before she disappeared. She had been babysitting for your family for months, and at first, everything seemed fine. She really liked you kids, always talked about how sweet Darren was. But then something changed. April gripped the phone tighter. What kind of change? She became secretive, nervous. She would come home from babysitting jobs at your house and go straight to her room without saying anything. When I asked her about it, she would just say that adults were more complicated than she had expected. I thought maybe your parents were having marital problems, and she felt uncomfortable being in the middle of it. Did she ever say anything specific about my father? Carol hesitated. A few weeks before she disappeared, Jenny came home very upset. She had been crying and her clothes were disheveled. When I pressed her about what had happened, she finally told me that your father that he had made advances toward her that night. April felt the air leave her lungs. What kind of advances? She said he had been drinking when she arrived to babysit, which was unusual. Your mother was working late, and you and Darren were already asleep. Jennifer said your father kept finding reasons to come into whatever room she was in, standing too close, making comments about how mature she looked. When she tried to leave early, he blocked the doorway and tried to kiss her. The image of her father forcing himself on their teenage babysitter made April feel physically sick. What did Jennifer do? She managed to get away from him that night, but she was terrified. She wanted to stop babysitting for your family, but she needed the money. Her parents had cut her off financially when she moved out, and she was struggling to pay rent. So she kept going back, but she made me promise to call and check on her whenever she was babysitting at your house. April's mind was racing. Carol, the night she disappeared, did you call to check on her? Yes, I called around 9 o'clock, but no one answered the phone. I tried several more times over the next few hours, but there was never any answer. I figured maybe she had taken the kids somewhere, or maybe the phone was just off the hook. It wasn't until the next day when she didn't come home that I started to really worry. After ending the call with Carol, April sat in her car outside the library, trying to process what she had learned. Her father had been sexually pursuing their babysitter, creating a situation that had escalated to murder when Jennifer threatened to expose him. The timeline was becoming clearer, but it also raised new questions about Darren's role in the tragedy. If Jennifer had been killed on October 14th and Darren hadn't disappeared until October 31st, what had happened during those 2.5 weeks? Had Darren witnessed something that night? Had he seen his father kill Jennifer or discovered her body? And if so, why had Robert Miller waited so long before silencing his son? April decided to visit the neighborhood where Jennifer had lived, hoping to find other people who might remember something about that time. The apartment complex was still there, though it had been renovated and expanded over the years. She knocked on doors, introducing herself to longtime residents and asking about their memories of 1983. Most people had no clear recollection of Jennifer Patterson or her disappearance, but one elderly woman named Mrs. Garcia remembered the incident vividly. She had lived in the apartment next to Jennifer and Carol and had been awakened by arguing voices on the night Jennifer disappeared. It was maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock, Mrs. Garcia told April as they sat in her small living room. I heard a man's voice, very angry, and a young woman crying. I almost called the police, but then everything got quiet. I figured it was just another boyfriend drama. You know how young people can be. Did you recognize the man's voice? Had you heard it before? Mrs. Garcia shook her head. No, it wasn't anyone I knew. But I remember thinking he sounded older, more mature than the boys Jenny usually dated. His voice had authority to it, if you know what I mean. April felt a chill run down her spine. The description fit her father perfectly. Robert Miller had been 41 in 1983, significantly older than the college-aged men Jennifer would typically have socialized with, and he had certainly possessed the kind of authoritative voice that Mrs. Garcia described. Mrs. Garcia, did you see anything that night? Any cars or people leaving the complex? Well, now that you mention it, I did see something strange. Maybe an hour after the arguing stopped, I got up to get a glass of water, and I looked out my window. There was a pickup truck parked behind the building near the dumpsters. The back was covered with a tarp, like someone was hauling something they didn't want people to see. April's heart was pounding. Did you see who was driving the truck? No, it was too dark, but I thought it was odd because residents weren't supposed to park back there. It was just for maintenance vehicles and trash pickup. The truck was gone by morning, so I didn't think much about it at the time. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Her father had gone to Jennifer's apartment that night, probably to confront her about the sexual assault he had attempted. When the confrontation escalated to violence, he had killed her and transported her body in his pickup truck. Then he had buried her in the family backyard, where no one would think to look. But that still didn't explain what had happened to Darren 2.5 weeks later. If the babysitter was already dead and buried, what threat could a 9-year-old boy have posed? April drove back to her childhood neighborhood, parking across the street from the house where she had grown up. The crime scene tape was gone now, But the backyard remained excavated, a gaping wound in the earth where 2 people had been buried for 20 years. She tried to imagine what it had been like for her family to live in that house, knowing what was buried beneath their feet. Had her mother known? It seemed impossible that Robert Miller could have killed 2 people and buried them in their backyard without his wife's knowledge. The digging alone would have been a major undertaking, requiring hours of work. And living with that secret for 20 years would have required a level of complicity that April didn't want to attribute to her mother. But as she thought back to her mother's behavior during those years, certain details began to take on new significance. Her mother had always been nervous about the backyard, discouraging the children from playing near the back fence. She had insisted on planting a garden exactly where the bodies were buried, claiming she wanted to grow vegetables for the family. But April now realized that the garden might have been intended to disturb the soil and mask any settling that might have occurred over the graves. The thought that both of her parents might have been involved in covering up these murders was almost too much to bear. April had spent 20 years grieving for what she thought were innocent victims of tragedy. Now she was discovering that they might have been calculating killers who had destroyed their own family to protect their secrets. As she sat in her car, staring at the house that had once represented safety and love, April's phone rang. It was Detective Santos, and her voice carried an urgency that made April's stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. Chen, we need you to come down to the station immediately. We've received the preliminary DNA results from the remains, and there's something you need to know." "What kind of something?" "The female victim, the one you identified as Jennifer Patterson. The DNA results indicate that she was pregnant at the time of her death, about 12 to 14 weeks along." April felt the world spinning around her as the implications hit her. Jennifer had been pregnant when she was killed. And if the timeline was correct, if she had been sexually assaulted by Robert Miller in the weeks before her death, then the baby she was carrying might have been his. "Detective, does this mean—" "It means we have a much clearer motive for murder, Mrs. Chen. If your father was the baby's father, Jennifer's pregnancy would have represented a threat that could have destroyed his marriage, his family, and his reputation. That's a powerful reason to kill." As April drove to the police station, her mind reeled with the horrific implications of this new information. Her father hadn't just been a man who had made inappropriate advances toward their babysitter. He had been a rapist who had gotten his victim pregnant, then murdered her to cover up his crimes. And somehow Darren had become entangled in this web of violence and deception. But even as the evidence against her father mounted, April couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something she was missing. The investigation had answered many questions about how Jennifer and Darren had died, but it still hadn't explained why her father had kept the gun and keychain, or why he had suffered so visibly for 20 years if he was simply a cold-blooded killer. There was something else, something darker and more complex than even this nightmare scenario suggested, and April was beginning to suspect that when she finally uncovered the whole truth, it would be worse than anything she had yet imagined. Detective Santos was waiting for April in the same interview room where they had met before, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes sat across from her, his hands folded carefully on the table. When April entered, he stood and extended his hand with the practiced gesture of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Frank Morrison from the County Sheriff's Office. He's been reviewing some old case files that might be connected to our investigation." April shook Morrison's hand, noting the calluses that suggested he was close to retirement but still actively working cases. His expression was grave as they all took their seats around the small table. "Mrs. Chen, Detective Santos filled me in on what you've discovered about your family. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but it's important that you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." April braced herself for whatever revelation was coming next. After everything she had learned in the past week, she thought she was prepared for anything. She was wrong. "In 1979, 4 years before your brother disappeared, we had another missing persons case involving a young woman named Lisa Hartwell. She was 22 years old, worked as a nanny for several families in the area. She vanished one evening after telling her roommate she was going to work a late babysitting job. Detective Morrison opened a thick file folder and placed a photograph on the table. The woman in the picture was blonde and petite, with a bright smile that reminded April painfully of Jennifer Patterson. Lisa's case went cold after a few months. No body was ever found, No solid leads developed. But there were similarities to Jennifer Patterson's disappearance that we couldn't ignore once Detective Santos brought me up to speed on your current investigation. April stared at the photograph, her mind racing. Are you saying my father might have killed other people? We're saying it's a possibility we have to explore. Both Lisa and Jennifer were young women who worked as babysitters. Both disappeared after supposedly going to work evening jobs that couldn't be verified. And both cases went nowhere because there wasn't enough evidence to pursue. Detective Santos leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, we need to ask you some questions about your family's history with babysitters. Can you remember other young women who worked for your family during the early 1980s? April tried to think back, but her memories of that period were fragmented. She had been young herself, not paying close attention to the rotating cast of teenagers who occasionally watched her and Darren when her parents went out. There were several girls over the years, she said slowly, but I can't remember all their names. My parents didn't go out very often, so we didn't need babysitters on a regular basis. Detective Morrison pulled out another photograph, this one showing a dark-haired young woman with serious eyes. Does this face look familiar to you? April studied the picture carefully. There was something about the woman's features that seemed familiar, but she couldn't place her. I'm not sure. Maybe. Who is she? Her name was Sarah Chen. No relation to you, despite the shared surname. She disappeared in 1981, also after allegedly going to a babysitting job. We're starting to see a pattern here, Mrs. Chen. 3 young women, all babysitters, all disappearing under similar circumstances over a 4-year period. The implications were staggering. April had been prepared to accept that her father might have killed Jennifer Patterson and Darren in a moment of panic or rage. But 3 separate victims over 4 years suggested something much more sinister. A serial killer who had been operating in their community for years, targeting vulnerable young women. Detective Morrison, are you suggesting that my father was some kind of serial killer? We're exploring that possibility. The pattern fits. Isolated victims who wouldn't be missed immediately. A perpetrator with access to potential targets through legitimate means, and a method of operation that minimized the risk of discovery. Detective Santos added, what's particularly troubling is that all 3 women disappeared after going to babysitting jobs that couldn't be verified. It suggests that the killer was using false pretenses to lure them to isolated locations where he could control the situation. April felt physically sick as she absorbed this information. The father she had loved and mourned for 20 years was emerging as a monster who had preyed on young women for his own twisted gratification. But even as the evidence mounted, part of her mind rebelled against accepting such a horrible truth. But why would he bury Jennifer in our backyard if he had been killing other women? Wouldn't that be incredibly risky? Detective Morrison nodded. That's a good question, and it suggests that Jennifer's case might have been different somehow. Maybe she threatened to expose him, or maybe she fought back in a way that forced him to act more hastily than usual. The pregnancy certainly adds a complicating factor that wouldn't have been present with other victims. What about the other women, Lisa and Sarah? Have you found any trace of their remains? Not yet, but we're organizing search teams to examine other properties that your father had access to during that time period. We're looking at his workplace, relatives' homes, anywhere he might have been able to bury evidence without arousing suspicion. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond anything April had imagined when she first found that toolbox in her father's basement. What had started as a quest to understand her brother's disappearance had uncovered what appeared to be a series of murders spanning several years. Detective Santos pulled out a legal pad covered with handwritten notes. Mrs. Chen, I need you to think very carefully about your father's behavior during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Did you notice any changes in his routine? Any periods when he was away from home more than usual? Any unexplained trips or activities? April tried to focus on those distant memories, but they were hazy and incomplete. She had been so young, and children don't typically pay attention to the subtle changes in adult behavior that might indicate something sinister. I remember that he worked a lot of overtime during those years, she said finally. He would often come home late, sometimes not until after Darren and I were asleep. My mother would complain about it sometimes, saying she felt like a single parent. Do you remember any specific time periods when this was particularly pronounced? April thought harder, trying to pin down specific time frames. The summer of 1981 was bad. He was working almost every evening, and weekends too. My mother was really upset about it because we had planned a family vacation that got cancelled, because he said he couldn't take time off. Detective Morrison made notes as she spoke. That time frame coincides with Sarah Chen's disappearance. She went missing in July of 1981. The correlation sent chills down April's spine. Her father's increased work schedule hadn't been about dedication to his job. It had been cover for his hunting and killing of innocent young women. "There's something else," April said, a memory surfacing unbidden. "After Darren disappeared, my father stopped working overtime altogether. It was like he suddenly didn't need those extra hours anymore. At the time, I thought it was because he was too depressed to focus on work. But now it suggests that he stopped killing after your brother's death," Detective Santos finished, which raises the question of why. What changed that made him stop? April had been wondering the same thing. If her father had been a serial killer for years, what had caused him to suddenly cease his activities after Halloween 1983? The most obvious answer was that Darren's death had somehow satisfied whatever compulsion had been driving him to kill, but that raised even more disturbing questions about the relationship between her brother's murder and the deaths of the young women. "Detectives, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think Darren was killed because he witnessed something, or do you think there was another reason?" The two detectives exchanged glances before Detective Santos answered carefully. "We're still developing our theory about that, Mrs. Chen, but we think it's possible that your brother's death wasn't just about silencing a witness. Given the pattern of victims, it's possible that your father's crimes were escalating." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. April felt her understanding of the case shift once again, accommodating a possibility so horrible she could barely process it. "Are you saying you think my father that Darren might have been targeted for the same reasons as the young women?" Detective Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Chen, serial killers often escalate over time. Their victim selection can change. Their methods can evolve. It's possible that by 1983, your father's compulsions had developed to the point where age and gender were less important than availability and vulnerability." April felt the room spinning around her as the full horror of what they were suggesting sank in. Her 9-year-old brother hadn't just been silenced to protect her father's other crimes. He had been murdered because he fit the profile of her father's preferred victims, young, innocent, and completely at his mercy. "I think I'm going to be sick," April said, standing abruptly from the table. Detective Santos quickly guided her to a nearby bathroom, where April lost what little she had eaten that day. When she finally emerged, shaky and pale, Detective Morrison was waiting with a cup of water and a concerned expression. "Mrs. Chen, I know this is incredibly difficult, but we need you to understand that if our theory is correct, your father was an extremely dangerous individual who operated undetected for years. The fact that he stopped killing after 1983 suggests that something about Darren's death either satisfied his compulsions or frightened him enough to make him stop." April took a sip of water, trying to steady herself. What could have frightened him enough to stop killing? Maybe the risk of killing someone so close to home finally made him realize he could be caught. Or maybe your brother's death was different somehow, more personal, and it changed something fundamental about your father's psychology. As April left the police station that afternoon, her mind was reeling with possibilities she didn't want to consider. The investigation had revealed her father to be not just a killer, but potentially a serial killer who had preyed on young people for years. And her brother's death wasn't just a tragic loss, but potentially the culmination of a pattern of escalating violence that had been building for years. But even as she tried to process these revelations, April couldn't shake the feeling that there were still crucial pieces missing from the puzzle. The investigation had explained who her father's victims were and roughly when they had died, but it still hadn't answered the fundamental question of why. What had driven Robert Miller to become a killer? What had started him on this path of violence and deception? And most importantly, what had really happened on Halloween night 1983? Because despite everything she had learned, April sensed that the true story of Darren's final hours was still hidden, waiting to be uncovered. And when that story finally came to light, she suspected it would be more horrifying than anything she had yet imagined. That night, April found herself unable to sleep, her mind churning through the horrific revelations of the day. She sat in her hotel room with her laptop, researching everything she could find about serial killers and their patterns of behavior. The clinical descriptions of escalation and victim selection felt surreal when applied to her own father, but they also provided a framework for understanding the nightmare her family had unknowingly been living through. Around 2 a.m, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Santos's number, and April answered immediately, her heart racing with the possibility of new developments. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry to call so late, but we've had a breakthrough. We found something in your father's old work records that changes everything we thought we knew about this case." April sat up straighter, fully alert despite her exhaustion. "What did you find?" "Your father's employment records show that he was actually fired from the hardware store in March of 1983, not laid off in the summer like we originally thought. He had been caught stealing from the store multiple times, and when confronted about it, he became violent with his supervisor." The timeline April had been constructing in her mind shifted again. If her father had lost his job in March, that meant he had been unemployed for 8 months before Darren's disappearance, not just a few weeks as the family had believed. "Detective, that changes the entire time frame. It means he was out of work during all 3 disappearances, not just Jennifer's." "Exactly. And it means he had much more opportunity to plan and execute these crimes than we originally realized. But there's more, Mrs. Chen. The reason your father was stealing from the hardware store wasn't random petty theft. He was taking very specific items: rope, duct tape, plastic sheeting, lime. All things that could be used to restrain, transport, and dispose of victims." April felt her stomach clench as the implications became clear. Her father hadn't been driven to kill by sudden impulses or moments of rage. He had been methodically planning and preparing for these murders, stealing the supplies he needed from his workplace over a period of months. "Mrs. Chen, we need you to come in first thing tomorrow morning. We want to show you some evidence we've recovered from the search of other properties, and we need your help interpreting some items we found." After hanging up, April paced her hotel room, trying to process this new information. Her father had been a calculating predator who had used his position at the hardware store to acquire the tools of his trade. The man she remembered as patient and loving had actually been methodically planning the torture and murder of innocent young women. But something still bothered her about the timeline. If her father had been unemployed since March 1983, how had he maintained the facade of going to work every day? Where had he been spending his time? And how had he supported the family financially during those months? The next morning, April arrived at the police station to find Detective Santos waiting with several evidence boxes and a grim expression. The items spread across the interview table looked innocuous enough individually, but taken together they painted a picture of meticulous preparation for unspeakable acts. "We found these buried in various locations around the county," Detective Santos explained. "Shallow graves that contained supplies but no bodies. It appears your father had multiple cache sites where he stored equipment for his crimes." April examined the evidence bags containing rope, plastic ties, rolls of duct tape, and other restraints. There were also items that made her blood run cold: women's jewelry, driver's licenses, and other personal effects that had obviously been taken as trophies. "We've identified some of these items as belonging to Lisa Hartwell and Sarah Chen," Detective Santos continued, "which confirms that your father was responsible for their deaths as well." One evidence bag contained something that made April's hands shake: a small charm bracelet with cartoon characters that she recognized immediately. "That belonged to Darren," she whispered. "He got it as a prize at the county fair the summer before he died. He wore it everywhere, even though the other kids teased him about it being too girly." Detective Santos made a note. "So your father kept trophies from all his victims, including his own son. That's consistent with the psychology of serial killers who are driven by the need to relive their crimes." April forced herself to look at the other items in the evidence bags. There were photographs too damaged by time and moisture to make out clearly, but obviously personal mementos taken from victims. The level of planning and organization required to maintain these trophy caches over several years spoke to a level of criminal sophistication that was chilling. "Detective, you said yesterday that my father stopped killing after Darren's death. But if he was this organized, this careful, why would he suddenly stop, and why would he keep evidence that could incriminate him?" "Those are excellent questions, Mrs. Chen, and we think we might have found the answer." Detective Santos pulled out another evidence bag, this one containing what appeared to be a journal or diary. The pages were water-damaged and partially illegible, but sections of text were still visible. "We found this in the same cache where your brother's bracelet was buried. It appears to be your father's record of his crimes, written in some kind of code. Our analysts are still working on deciphering most of it, but we've been able to translate some key passages." She opened to a page marked with a sticky note and began reading in a flat, professional tone that couldn't mask the horror of the content. Entry dated September 15th, 1983. The hunger grows stronger each time. J was not enough. The fear in her eyes was perfect, but it ended too quickly. Need to be more careful with the next one. Need to make it last longer. April felt bile rising in her throat. The clinical description of Jennifer Patterson's murder, reduced to notes about the killer's satisfaction and plans for improvement, was almost unbearable to hear. "There's more," Detective Santos continued, flipping to another marked page. Entry dated October 25th, 1983, 6 days before Darren disappeared. Perfect opportunity presenting itself. Close to home means maximum control. Have been watching and planning. This one will be different. This one will be special. The implication was clear and horrifying. Her father had been planning Darren's murder for at least a week before Halloween, treating his own son as just another victim in his escalating series of crimes. "Mrs. Chen, there's one more entry that we need you to hear. It's dated November 2nd, 1983, 2 days after your brother's death." Detective Santos turned to the final marked page, her voice becoming even more strained as she read. "It is finished. The hunger is gone. D was perfect. Everything I had been building toward. The fear, the trust, the betrayal, all of it exactly as I had imagined. But something broke inside when it was over. The satisfaction I expected was replaced by emptiness. I think I am done with this. I think I'm finally satisfied." April couldn't hold back her tears any longer. The cold clinical description of her brother's murder, written by their own father, was beyond anything she had prepared herself to hear. Darren hadn't just been a victim of opportunity or a witness who needed to be silenced. He had been the culmination of her father's escalating fantasies, chosen specifically because of the unique psychological satisfaction his death would provide. "I need a moment," April managed to say through her tears. Detective Santos nodded understandingly and left her alone with the evidence, giving her time to process the magnitude of what she was learning. As April sat surrounded by the remnants of her father's crimes, she began to understand why he had suffered so visibly for 20 years after Darren's death. It wasn't guilt over killing his son that had tormented him. It was the emptiness that had followed, the realization that achieving his ultimate fantasy had left him hollow rather than satisfied. Robert Miller had spent years building toward the perfect crime, the perfect victim, the perfect kill, and when he had finally achieved it by murdering his own son, he had discovered that the reality couldn't match the fantasy he had constructed. The hunger that had driven him to kill was gone, but it had been replaced by a different kind of torment, the knowledge that he had destroyed everything meaningful in his life in pursuit of a satisfaction that had proven to be illusory. When Detective Santos returned, April had composed herself enough to ask the questions that were burning in her mind. "Detective, what about my mother? The journal entries suggest my father was operating alone, but how could she not have known something? How could she have lived with a serial killer for years without suspecting anything?" "That's something we're still investigating, Mrs. Chen. It's possible that your mother was completely unaware of your father's activities. Some serial killers are remarkably skilled at compartmentalizing their lives, maintaining a normal facade while conducting their crimes in secret. But it's also possible that she knew something and chose not to see it, or that she was actively involved in covering up the crimes after the fact." The thought that her mother might have been complicit in these murders added another layer of horror to an already unbearable situation. April had been prepared to accept that her father was a monster, but the possibility that her mother had also been involved challenged everything she thought she knew about her family. "What happens now?" April asked. "Where does the investigation go from here?" "We're going to continue searching for the remains of Lisa Hartwell and Sarah Chen. We're also going to examine your father's activities more closely, looking for evidence of other possible victims. Serial killers rarely limit themselves to just a few murders, especially when they operate undetected, for as long as your father did." As April left the police station that afternoon, she realized that her quest for answers about Darren's disappearance had uncovered something far worse than she had ever imagined. Her father hadn't just been a man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. He had been a predator who had spent years perfecting his craft, culminating in the murder of his own son as the ultimate expression of his twisted desires. But even as the investigation continued to reveal new horrors, April knew that there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered. The journal entries had provided insight into her father's mindset, but they raised new questions about the full scope of his crimes and the possibility that others in the community had been involved in covering them up. And somewhere in those remaining secrets, April sensed, lay truths that would be even more devastating than anything she had yet discovered.